The test. Okay. To be aimed toward me?
However you want.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to look at it, so if it'll pick me up just by looking down here or out there, I'm good. Are we good on sound? Can you hear all right? Nope.
I think, yeah.
It's recording. This is just for recording then. It's not.
This is just for amplification.
Okay.
It's recording.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. We don't have a great. So maybe.
How's that for sound? Is that picking up at all? It's a little. You can hear me. Okay. It may not be coming through here, so we'll see. Okay. Well, I didn't know if she had any preliminary things to say about the Dekalb History Center, but if you're not a member, I hope you'll join. It's they're sponsoring activities like this, and I think they do very good work over the years, and of course keeping the archive of DeKalb County. We're now in the front row, so I'm being attacked forthwith. Excellent. Well, this, after probably giving the longest talk that I needed to give last time, and poor souls went through nearly 2 hours of this, I'm not going to do that again. But this may have the longest title that you've seen recently, so I'm going to read it in case you can't read it from there. Defining Eastlake Victorian, Artistic and Mechanical Explorations of Victorian Gingerbread and the Architecture and Furniture of the Scroll Saw and the Lathe. Now that sounds kind of technology, but it's not going to be too much of that, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. This is a part of a series of talks trying to define different Victorian styles of architecture, recognizing that that's a term that seems to be applied to a great deal of architecture without, in every case, a lot of meaning, but other than the fact that the building was built during the reign of Victoria. So I want to address that initially and suggest that the stylistic term Victorian, just by itself, has come to mean in 19th century architecture any elaborate, even excessive ornamentation and ostentation evidenced in either interior furnishings or architectural embellishments. It was always said that Queen Victoria had a personality where if she liked something, she absolutely adored it. And if she didn't like it, she despised it. And so had these very strong, exaggerated extremes in her own personality. Observers are prompted to label as generically Victorian any ornate piece of late 19th century furniture or extravagantly decorated building of the period. And on the other hand, it seems reasonable to assume that a single stylistic term could not apply in a meaningful way to the numerous artistic explorations and formal or ornamental modes in architecture or furnishings that were evidenced during so lengthy a period as Queen Victoria's 63-and-a-half-year reign. When the young Victoria came to the throne in England in 1837, the Greek revival was the prevailing style in the United States. Hardly what we would likely call Victorian, but is built during the Victorian era. And in England, the Regency and various Italianate modes were prevalent. When she died, the 20th century had already opened, and what Nicholas Pevsner has called the pioneers of modern design were already stripping architecture of its ornamental excesses. And neither an 1837 temple house in the Greek mode, nor a 1901 design by Frank Lloyd Wright, or even the 1891 Tower House in England by Charles Voysey on the right, built about a dozen years after William Burgess's much more self-evidently Victorian Tower House in Holland Park, could be called aesthetically Victorian, despite the fact that all 4 of these houses were built during Victoria's reign. On the other hand, from Carpenter Gothic gingerbread to Eastlake Victorian woodwork, elaborately ornate 19th century architecture during Victoria's reign encouraged the stylistic term Victorian. And the more enthusiastic, even excessive the decorative expression, the more Victorian such buildings and furniture appeared to be. Such ornament resulted from explorations and the use of machines and tools of the pre-industrial age, carried to excess perhaps as a result of advances in mechanical design and easier power to run the machines. And this link between aesthetics and technology is exemplary of the Victorian age. It was a period of both artistic and mechanical exploration and enthusiastic application. In the 19th century, the scroll saw or jigsaw was employed to shape the edges and cut out the patterns of Carpenter Gothic woodwork, from sawtooth profiles to stenciling, creating pattern work of varied sorts, generically nicknamed gingerbread. But there is a prehistory suggesting by the very term jigsaw, if we remind ourselves that jigsaw puzzles date from 1767, when an engraver and map maker named John Spilsbury pasted a map onto wood and then cut it into small pieces, creating what he called dissected maps, but also inventing the jigsaw puzzle. He used marquetry or fret saw to cut around the borders of countries in order to teach British children geography. The fret saw, or the marquetry saw, was handheld and is part of the pre-industrial artisanship linked historically to mosaic work, to marquetry, and to early stencil cuts, as well as to gingerbread in architectural ornament. Early fragmented maps and pictures were not actually called jigsaw puzzles until the late 19th century, when the development of a treadle saw allowed for more efficient execution of such multiple cuts and random shapes by which the modern jigsaw puzzle is known, especially when cardboard began to be used. Many were initially divided by die cutting, a process in which a cookie cutter-like knife was simply pushed down and through the flat cardboard image, dividing the multiple pieces all at once. Further development of the scroll saw continued apace during the whole of the Industrial Revolution. The first patent for a saw using a reciprocating steel blade was granted in 1829 in Great Britain, although a later patent made reference to the scroll saw as an American invention that was displayed at the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in London. By 1857, additional patents reflected improvements, and by the 1860s, the first mechanically powered scroll saws were in use in the United States, using a foot-powered treadle, a hand crank, or a metal mechanism. Throughout the mid-19th century and later, carpenters used scroll saws to cut ornamental gingerbread patterns on buildings, especially houses, at gable ends, along the roof eaves and porches, and as flat stencil infill below banisters on stairs and porches in lieu of balustrades. Now this one I'm cheating a little bit because this porch ornament is something we added to our house in 2005 to make it compatible and characteristic with the other Eastlake Victorian aspects, but this was a stair going up to a new door. Panels and brackets also displayed stencils and scroll saw shaped strap work. And inside the house, and these are all actually from the Smith-Benning house, scroll patterns adorned staircases, wall plaques, and picture frames, as well as elaborate high Victorian furniture with sawtooth crowns and aprons, joining lathe turnings and chamfered and beveled corners and ornamental spindles and spools and bobbins that had been recruited as ornament for both furniture and architecture. The lathe and the art of turning, these have a longer tradition with some parallels to the development of the scroll saw during the 19th century. However, the use of the lathe reaches back to ancient, even prehistoric times. In August 2011, an early Bronze Age burial cist, a small 4,000-year-old chamber made of thin stone slabs, was discovered on the Dartmoor in Devon. Inside, archaeologists discovered the cremated remains of a female, and almost unique for this period, they also found well-preserved grave goods, including 4 lathe-turned ear studs. Ancient documentation of the existence and use of primitive lathes has been recorded in Egyptian wall paintings, although the most primitive lathes required an assistant to turn the lathe while an artisan cut the patterns, both usually sitting on the ground. Sometimes a single boy or a single individual could pull the cord or band with one hand and rotate the lathe and cut the pattern with the other. The development of what became known as the spring pole lathe made rotation easier but irregular. With such lathes, the upper end of the driving cord is attached to the tip of a flexible pole, and the other end is fastened to a simple treadle arrangement below the bed of the lathe. It should be noted that the function of the pole is to act as a return spring and to keep the string taut, nothing more. Such pole lathes have been used since about 500 BC, continuously up to recent times. For its time, this was a major technological breakthrough. It not only freed the turner from the need of an assistant, but also enabled him to stand while working the lathe instead of having to sit on the ground. Together, these factors gave him more control over the turning process and made it possible for the turner to control the rhythm of work. Artists have recorded these developments and other woodworking activities in both stained glass. Here is a view on the bottom left from Chartres Cathedral showing joiners in the woodworker's window, and also in medieval manuscripts, which is what's on the top. And you can see there's people working on lathes in both of these images. The medieval manuscript is showing a pole lathe. Wheels of various sizes provided more regular rotations, and a sketch in Leonardo da Vinci's notebook discloses a significant innovation in his day that was either his invention or simply a record of a contemporary development. This was the tread-powered lathe, in which the foot power on the diagonal board at the base spun the wheel and the lathe. Leonardo's treadle was connected directly to a crank drive shaft, and thus would turn only as fast as the operator could pump with his foot down below. The foot treadle wheel lathe was a significant advance, but it was limited in terms of both the stamina of the operator and the size of the object the lathe could turn. Heavier work required larger wheels, and some more than 6 feet in diameter and freestanding, linked to the lathe by a cord or a belt, further improved the workmanship. 1 or 2 men stood at the wheel crank handle to turn the wheel, while the turner stood with chisels to shape the rotating balustrade or post or other large object. When stepped pulleys were introduced, additional gear ratios were available. The great wheel also provided more even rotation and improved control of the work, but it was still powered by humans. Thus, it cannot be said that the lathe was a 19th century invention, although significant developments transpired during the century to enhance wood and metal lathe production, and by the late century, the late Victorian era, to make the lathe the principal tool in the creation of a new style of furniture and architecture. The final step required a means other than a human's physical labor to power the lathe. From classical times, man has harnessed wind and water to work heavy machinery, to relieve him of such physical efforts in artistic and constructional activities, and to speed up production. In southern France in about 200 AD, a Roman settlement employed 16 water wheels to grind corn, but it would take another 16 centuries to develop the use of water-driven lathes in any widespread way in Europe. At the other end of the industrial age, water wheel axles there developed a system of pulleys and belts transferring the power to multiple rotating lathes. In the early 19th century, for instance, the bobbin masters of Cumbria in northwest England, this is a view of a bobbin factory, installed water wheels to drive the lathes of their bobbin factories. An interesting number of cotton spinning mills in the Midlands created a huge demand for wooden bobbins. By 1854, the water wheel at Stock Park bobbin mill had been replaced with water turbines. 150 years earlier, an Englishman, Captain Thomas Savery, built a steam engine in 1698. It worked as a pump, and Savery called it an, quote, engine to raise water by fire, unquote. Of course, history has long acknowledged that the first practical steam engine applicable to various other uses was developed sporadically between 1763 and 1775 by James Watt, and some support from Matthew Boulton. Theirs would be the invention that would become one of the driving forces of the Industrial Revolution. Early steam engines, however, were huge and found early application in pumping water out of mines, and only later in support of heavy engineering machinery employed in factory production, including machine tools such as metal-working lathes. By the middle of the 19th century, steam engines were employed extensively to drive woodworking machinery in a factory with specialized needs, such as that turning bobbins in Cumbria for the cotton industry. Finally, in 1860, the first internal combustion engine was built. Advances such as these allowed James East in Chesham, Buckinghamshire, to run a number of wooden bedded lathes from a single engine via line shafting mounted in the roof space, powered by an engine that kept the line shaft in continuous motion. Of course, in the 20th century, electricity would power these factory lathes. Well, at the height of this mid to late Victorian era, an English architect named Charles Locke Eastlake published his seminal book called Hints on Household Taste in Furniture, Upholstery, and Other Details. As stated in his preface, the architect's purpose was, quote, to suggest some fixed principles of taste for the popular guidance of those who are not accustomed to hear such principles defined, unquote. A little bit of a slap on his own readership, I think. The book appeared in London in 1868. It was reissued with a second revised edition in 1869, and in 1872, an American edition was published with 6 more U.S. editions by 1881. Trained by an architect, Philip Hardwick, Eastlake served from 1866 to 1877 as secretary of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and although he did not manufacture any furniture himself, nor are there buildings to his credit as an architect, his furniture designs were produced by professional cabinet makers in England, such as Jackson and Graham, and became widely popular. He lamented the widespread copying of his designs, however, quote, without the working drawings necessary for their proper execution, unquote. He also favored artisan handiwork to machine production, although the so-called American Eastlake furniture was mass-produced. He wrote, quote, I find American tradesmen continually advertising what they are pleased to call Eastlake furniture, with the production of which I have nothing whatsoever to do, and for the taste of which I should be very sorry to be considered responsible, unquote. Nonetheless, his name would be given to the new style of both furniture and architectural design, the Eastlake style. And while the wood carving knife, the chisel, the gouge would be the instruments with which artisans would cut decorative patterns on interior furnishings, on stone ornament, and on architectural panels, the most defining feature and characteristic of the new Eastlake style would be the products of the scroll saw and the lathe. Stencils, incised lines, sawtooth profiles, and turned columns became hallmarks of his Eastlake style. Motifs borrowed from Eastlake furniture then enriched a peculiarly Eastlake architecture, especially in the United States, where wood was plentiful and new wealth encouraged Americans toward ever more elaborate ornamentation, particularly in the public rooms and on the exteriors of their Victorian, as in quotes now, homes. The furniture that Eastlake designed was a reaction against the curve, that evil progenitor of rickety structures, instability, and discomfort, in particular evidenced in the stylistic excesses of Victorian Rococo revival popularized by Belter. In Eastlake furniture, Victorians were promised a new robustness and strength that was all the better for his designs and the materials that he used to produce them. His patronizing reference to the intended beneficent influence of his hints on household taste, unquote, have an air of what the British would call toffee-nosed condescension. Of course, it will take some time, Eastlake wrote, before this influence will extend to that unfortunately large class of British people who are indifferent to art of any kind and who only care to secure novelties, which may be as remarkable for ugliness as they are for beauty, in furnishing their homes. It is to be hoped that those who have had no opportunity, he carried on writing, of forming a judgment in such matters will by degrees take their cue from others of more cultivated taste, presumably from him. So instead of the prevailing novelties, Eastlake called for simple, sturdy, and well-crafted furniture. And if he never achieved the arts and crafts simplicity of Gimson and the Barnsleys in England or Gustav Stickley in the United States, his furniture looks forward to such work, avoiding excessive high-relief carving, explicit classical details, and the curves and busy decorative excesses of other styles of the day. Some American Eastlake motifs show influence from the aesthetic movement, including its Orientalism and from the American Renaissance forms. Moreover, Eastlake's interest in High English Gothic and the proto-modernist reformed aesthetic of his designs echoed messages being communicated by the arts and crafts movement. In America, his book and his furniture appeared just in time to be influential when they were displayed at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876. Illustrations in Hints on Household Taste disclose the debt his designs owe to the art of the turner and to the lathe. And as one observes, his lathe-turned table and chair legs, ornamental spindles, and rows of spools along chair crests or arms, one cannot help but think in architectural terms. Not only is the furniture masculine and sturdy, retaining an honest avoidance of artifice and ornament for its own sake, but it can appear architectonic, or at least translatable to architectural forms and ornament that are equally lathe-produced. The Eastlake style is the style of the turner's art, and the service of the lathe to both furniture and architecture is evidenced by lathe-produced chair legs, chair arm supports, spindle hall screens, as well as stair balustrades, veranda posts and balusters, and eave brackets. The imagery is all interchangeable. The translation of Eastlake's lathe-turned style to architecture in America was direct, especially in regions with predominantly wood frame architecture, houses structured by balloon framing, which were then adorned by jigsaw-produced and lathe-turned ornament. One might ask, what style is the 1883 Smith-Benning House in Candler Park in Atlanta? It has a tower with a mansard roof, which is a sign of the French Second Empire, stylistic influence, but it also is more characteristically Eastlake Victorian. Its stenciled window hoods, its jigsaw cutouts and lathe-turned porch posts, balustrades, and brackets make it an exemplary architectural reflection of Eastlake's aesthetic revolution. With interior furniture of the Eastlake style, the Smith-Benning's house style is also Eastlake in terms of its architecture. Since my wife and I bought the house when it was already 100 years old and when it was distinctly in derelict condition, we have since spent 40 years restoring it. Thus, one might more properly call it the Smith-Benning Craig House, a pedigree now suggested by a neo-Victorian jigsaw stencil pattern that my wife designed for the soffit vents along the veranda and the main roof overhangs. The arrangement is back-to-back S's for Smith, larger B's because the Bennings owned it for a longer time, and C's that stand for Smith-Benning Craig. And the size of each motif reflects how long each family has owned the house. Just a fun kind of thing to add to the restoration. Well, in conclusion, it should be submitted that such license may be just what Charles Eastlake disliked about American tradesmen manipulation of his design ideas and why he disapproved of their willingness to spread Eastlake furniture features into architecture throughout the English-speaking world. There is no question he would have been horrified by the most lavish of Eastlake Victorian wood frame houses. A well-known residence in California is our last set of images. This is from north of San Francisco in a town which is appropriately called Eureka. It stands today as the most excessive Victoria extravaganza in the Eastlake Victorian style that I could find. An appropriate note on which to conclude. The Carson house is an overblown pile attacked by the lathe and adorned by an accumulation of turnings, spindles, lathe-produced posts, and head-spinning ornament inside and out. As Eastlake wrote about some American Eastlake furniture, he also might easily have described the architecture of the 1884-5 William Carson House in Eureka as, quote, a production of which I have had nothing whatsoever to do, and for the taste of which I should be very sorry to be considered responsible. Nonetheless, we call his furniture progenies and their offspring architecture Eastlake Victorian. Thank you. Any questions or any comments? Things that you know of some great Eastlake houses around we should go look at? Yes.
I don't know that answer, but can you compare that to what is folk Victorian as opposed to Eastlake Victorian?
Well, folk usually implied a very kind of untutored, untrained, and relatively more simple application of whatever ornament or design is involved in the artwork. So when you think of folk art, it's often untrained. It can be reflective of high-style traditions, but they've been watered down by a kind of stronger sense of the vernacular as one. Folk and related terms are constantly being debated by art historians and architectural historians, and I'm not sure anybody's ever really totally come up with the best explanation of it, but that is more the character. Eastlake Victorian really implies a specific link to Charles Eastlake and his designs in his book, where he's promoting spindles and turned balustrades, and I mean the balustrades on the porch of the Smith-Benning house are just 45-degree angles of the same thing that if you turn them this way and ran them down the porch, they would be porch balustrades, but they're at the top of columns, and they're simply used as another decorative element to allow light and shade to enhance the character of the house. And the jigsaw allows for these stencil patterns, which you see inside and out as well. Yeah.
Did Eastlake care about particular woods, or did he care what kind of wood was used?
He was.
Yeah,
I can't remember if Hints on Household Taste argues for certain woods. What was happening is a lot of the woods as they moved out of Eastlake toward more arts and crafts, kind of craftsman style, was a preference for oaks and these stronger woods. But some of the American Renaissance used a whole range of more exotic woods and had more exotic finishes on them. And he was looking at kind of both in a way. But the drawings in his book were just black and white line drawings, so it was very hard to get any sense of what the surfaces were, and as I say, I just can't remember if he, having read this some time ago, whether he talks about advocating certain woods over others. But I'm guessing that a lot of what he was using was woods. If he was trying to do a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more American Renaissance version of this, there was one set of tables that I showed that influence, then he would be using Richard Woods. Yeah.
Precisely reproducing multiple spindles. And quite did they introduce mechanical means for reproducing spindles?
Well, I think the technology that first appeared in these bobbin factories, because it's a smaller scale, was allowing machine-driven lathes to increase the uniformity or protect the uniformity. And certainly if you're going to line up what would be normally have thread around it for sewing, but would just be a decorative element on the back of a bed, for instance, then you'd want that consistency, but it would be better treated with the mechanical device of a steam-driven or a mechanical-driven that is much more controllable than those earlier ones were. Yeah.
Some of the furniture I've seen from the aesthetic room, like Burke Brothers furniture for the Vanderbilt house. Would that be considered Eastlake?
Some of that comes from still an interest in classicism and the kind of balance that brought to it, but it's not totally. Herder is not really Eastlake. It almost is distinctly Herder Brothers. It's very much their own, partly because of the lavish mix of materials and the ornamentation, but the ornamentation is not as directly linked to these lathe turned and Turner activities as they are still derived from historic ornament that's applied to Herder's pieces. Robin, yeah. I don't know. It certainly went as wild with the painted lady kind of aesthetic in California, because this coincided, this woodwork and the elaboration of the woodwork in the 1880s coincided with treating each little piece a different color so it would stand out, and you kind of let color help define the purpose of every element of ornament, and so it just took on this extraordinary painted lady look. And I probably should have noted what Eastlake's years were, whether he was still around at that point, but come upon that, and that specifically. Yeah.
So did this most exclusively have the further exterior elements?
It was furniture primarily. It really was aimed at what we might think of as furnishings, furniture, and interior design. He would sometimes show a whole room wall or something because it was a piece of built-in furniture, and a lot of Eastlake furniture was built in. Break fronts in dining rooms, for instance, it would just be ornamented with some of this. And some of that goes back to even 17th century furnishings that you'd find. I remember I was at Winterthur for a summer institute for graduate students years and years ago, and one of the things that was really interesting about what Benno Foreman was sharing, he wrote one of the major studies of furniture in the 17th century, it was the art of the turner, which was the lathe turner, and the carver who would carve some incised decorative elements, and then the lathe machine itself that was so pronounced. But I'll just leave it at that. No, I've not seen anything that shows him playing architect. I mean, he was an architect, but then the sources indicate that there are no specific even built works that we can attribute to him. It's sort of like Ville. I mean, it's a few things that Ville actually built, but that's not what his importance was. And but I think his renown, especially in this country, was through the publication of his book. And when you get these books and they're published at a certain time, and then they go through 10 years of 6 or 7 more editions, it's very much on the minds of people that are involved in that kind of decorative work. It's very prominent. Yeah.
Do you know why his heirs were not globally local about having their name and their style connected to involved?
I'm guessing that Eastlake himself just thought it just kind of got out of hand and went to excess beyond what he really intended, and his designs have some elaboration clearly, but they're not nearly as pronounced, and the application from furniture to architecture is not anything that he was certainly advocating, and that's where it really went.
Trademarks available at the time he lived?
I don't know if he ever sought anything like that or not, but no, I mean, this is mostly, I'm not sure that there was a specific design that somebody might copy. They were looking at a type of furniture that manifested lathe-turned elements. Sometimes you could take something that you turn on a lathe like a balustrade, and you can literally slice it vertically and have two flat ends, and then apply that to the front of a piece of furniture, and a lot that's been done even since the 17th century in not so much high boys, but those 17th century linen presses. You'll see that, and sometimes they're just taking a circular element, slicing it down, and applying the flat side to a decorative element where you've got a completely half circle applied, and the style has its roots in 17th century, even American furniture does that, but his interest is just in applying what was current technology and available to furniture design that was going to simplify, and it still was ornamental, but it was going to simplify the forms of the pieces, especially when you think of what was being produced immediately prior to him. He is a reaction to this really excessive neo-rococo Victorian architecture. Belter is the big name producing, these sofas that have these rounded elements and they curve around, and there's not a quiet, line in it. And he was turning this more geometric into rectilinear pieces and applying the ornament. He was not enamored with the
more focused on
I think he recognized that advances in the technology allowed him to do what he was doing for his own furniture, and he was advocating through the drawings, but then he couldn't control what other people did with that. And as I say, I'm not even sure how long he lived as to whether he could even have known about something like the house in Eureka. But is that what you looked up? Yeah, okay. So he could have known it, but
Angela and Jim, there are neighborhoods, old neighborhoods called Eastlake. Do you think that has anything to do with his influence?
I don't think so, because the architecture of Eastlake is a bit more Morningside-ish. It's more 30s and 40s in a lot of cases, and the what we're talking about would primarily be 1870s and 80s. 1870s when his book was out in America, and 1880s when it's manifested in a lot of these Victorian houses. There, you can you can find, even on a small one-story, what you think of as a little Victorian cottage, but when you look at the porch railings and what they do on the front of the building, there are bits of Eastlake ornament, even though the rest of the building might not have any of the kind of elaboration that you see in this Carson house, or even the shapes that you see in the Smith-Benning house. And some of the massing of the Smith-Benning house is L-shaped, and I always thought this was kind of interesting because this was a prominent Italianate villa arrangement, this sort of asymmetry of an L-shaped element. But the only thing that was Italianate about it was when we first got the house, we noticed that some of the fireplace manels, which were cast iron, had Italianate ornament, much like marble Italianate fireplaces did during the time. But because earlier owners had converted the house to apartments and had lowered the ceilings, we had not realized that there were large arches, semicircular arches on one bay in the living room, separating the living room and the dining room with a big pocket door that was arched. And all that combined with the somewhat Italianate character of the fireplaces means that in addition to the French Second Empire mansard roof, it has that little bit of Italianate quality, and it has the Eastlake ornament. So it's this bouillabaisse of several things going on, but the most prominent, because there's so much ornament and stencil work and in lathe turn decoration inside and out, that we tend to call it Eastlake Victorian, is the pronounced style for the house. And because there isn't another one quite that excessive content, other than just, as I say, a few porch rails and balustrade ornaments on some smaller cottages here and there. Ken, yeah.
Ron, you've been very busy during the pandemic with publications. What's your next book? I know you've got a bunch of yours today. I hope it sells. What's your next project?
Well, what's been busy during the pandemic was it allowed me to get some of the Georgia Tech books out, the guidebook and all of that. I just last month had the first of what will be 2 companion books that take me back to Maryland. I've been sort of bouncing back on books about Ocean City, Maryland, which is where my summer cottage and where I grew up in the summer, and a lot of family connections there. It's the biggest summer beach resort in Maryland, it has an interesting history from 1875 on. And so these 2 most recent books, the first one is called Historic Lodgings of Ocean City, Maryland, and it looks at historic hotels, tourist camps and cabins, motels, the sort of what I call I stole it from somebody that described this term in New Jersey. There's a wonderful book called doo-wop motels. It's sort of 50s and 60s doo-wop motels, and then condo towers, and that transition on how people were housed. Ocean City is a town that when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s there, the population in the wintertime was probably around 3,000 permanent residents. On a good weekend, there are 350,000 people in Ocean City, Maryland, and they've got to sleep somewhere. And so this huge, it is in the motel era, it is Robert Venturi, personified in one section of what got developed over 15 blocks of the motel row. And then the earlier downtown has all these hotels. So people are interested in accommodations and the history of hotels. This is a book that it's over there because it just came out last month. It's based on a postcard collection. A lot of the buildings that have been lost are still recorded in postcards. And then the companion book that'll be out in August is on the same town, but it's on the historic boardwalk. It has a 3-mile timber boardwalk, and the beach and the bay, because it's a barrier island, so there's an ocean side and a bay side, so it's all about the recreational side of Ocean City. So these 2 are both based on a local postcard collection that I had access to, and so the book is actually dedicated to the people that collected these postcards for 4 decades, and so that's what I've been currently doing. I still have in mind to do a couple more architecture and art books in Atlanta. I'd like to do something on Heffernan, who designed the early modern work at Georgia Tech, a little bit more than what's in the guidebooks, and also Bush, Brown, and Gailey. I mean, that long tradition of work in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s and beyond. And then also Julian Harris, who has a chapter in the public arts book, but it's just a sort of introduction to his work. Julian Harris was he's sort of one of Atlanta's best kept secrets in a way. He was a sculptor who taught for years at Georgia Tech, taught sculpture to architects, started working, he actually was a graduate in architecture at Georgia Tech, graduated with his architecture degree and decided as he took his diploma that he didn't really want to be an architect. He went into the architecture program to begin with because it was the only program at Georgia Tech that would allow him to draw. And so he took the architecture degree, never practiced architecture, but never left his membership in the AIA and never really, he maintained his license the whole time, but really never practiced architecture. He goes to Philadelphia to learn sculpture. He does a whole series of sculptures on buildings in the 30s and 40s, some on Georgia Tech's campus, others elsewhere around Atlanta and the South. And then when they stopped doing that in the 50s, because everything was steel and glass, he started doing medallions. And he was so good at that that when the Société des Médaillonistes in Paris had a competition for designing their medallion for their society, he won the competition. And so he's doing the medallion for the medallionists. And he did the Fox Theater medallion and Jimmy Carter's inauguration medallion and all these kind of things on a smaller scale throughout his life. The highest honor that the American Institution of Architects, the AIA, can bestow is they give the gold medal to one architect every year. They've been doing this since the 19th century, and it's a really prominent award. There is one time in the history of this, in I think around 1954, that they did not give the gold medal out at all. Instead, they gave the Fine Arts Medal to Julian Harris. So he is that important, and yet we hardly know about his work. And so there is a chapter introducing that in the book back there that's on Atlanta's public art. There's a chapter on Portman, but not on his architecture. It's on his sculpture in there as well. And then a number of other things about murals around town and the thing. But that was a kind of kickstart. But I'd like to maybe do more of a monograph. The trouble is there's something like 28 boxes. Like Julian Harris left all his materials to the archives at Georgia Tech, and I've got to pour through all that before I can really go. And I photographed almost everything he did, but I haven't got haven't had the time yet to pour through these archival materials, so I can't really get that seriously on the table until I do that. So, yeah.
So we're hearing your talk on hours long. More or and I'm wondering, and this is out of curiosity, that's not cleaning in the Google file, is that exact picture?
Well,
What's the distinction between cleaning and
a lot of times, people pop up with things. I think the Eastlake Victorian has not really been refined and talked about that much, but Queen Anne makes reference to a Queen Anne style in England. And American Queen Anne doesn't look a whole lot like a Queen Anne in England, but there are certain motifs, the way bay windows are treated, the way gables are treated. When I was teaching this period in a survey of American architecture at Georgia Tech, I would show the Queen Anne first. And what it tended to do would be a matter of lots of prominent gables, often wide gables, corner cylindrical turrets with a conical candle snuffer roof on it, and a mixture of materials. It would have one portion of it be shingle, one portion of it be clapboard, a chimney that might have a stone foundation and then become brick, and all this kind of mixture. And so it took on this characteristic of variety in building materials, variety in building forms, and as a consequence, variety of interior spaces. And so those kinds of things characterize the Queen Anne. But the gable and the turret and the conical roof are the most prominent features of it in American Queen Anne. And you could then have a porch with Eastlake ornament wrapping around that veranda in a Queen Anne house, and that becomes as complicated as saying my house has a French Second Empire influence on a mansard roof on the tower, but it's Eastlake Victorian. I mean, they mix these things as they overlap. So. Are we out of gas?
I wanted to make one note. You were talking about Julian Harris.
Yes.
Across the street at the old First National Bank building where Little Shop of Stories are, there's two huge murals on either side of the door that
Now these are
1951.
and the building itself is by Francis Palmer Smith, who I've got a book back there on Francis Palmer Smith, and he is the man who founded the architecture program at Georgia Tech, essentially. Taught there for the first dozen years and has work all over the place. Francis Palmer Smith did that as a fairly late project, although he was active through the 60s. And his last major masterpiece was the Cathedral of St. Philip in Buckhead. So, I mean, it's the same man, but he's doing this. Probably the most modern thing he did in his whole career is this bank building, which now is it a Starbucks or it's?
It was a Starbucks, yeah. It's now a shop.
But he had Julian Harris carve these relief sculptures on the facade of it, so that's that close by to look at. So.
We do discuss it on our architects and architecture tour of Decatur.
That's right. That's an advantage.
Our next tour with that is